Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Measuring the State of Disaster Philanthropy 2019. Hi everybody, I'm Bob Ottenhoff, President and CEO of the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. Today's webinar is a special showcase of the 6th annual report, Measuring the State of Disaster Philanthropy 2019, and we like to call it Data to Drive Decisions. We'll provide background on the project, describe the research methodology, lift up key findings from this year's report, and hear about the impacts in Texas and Puerto Rico of hurricanes in 2017, the year of this report. First, a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive the link in a follow-up email. We'll also post the full recording and summary on our website. We encourage you to tweet your thoughts about the data and the webinar at hashtag SODP2019 or hashtag CDP4Recovery. I encourage you to submit questions at any time using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. The webinar is divided into 3 sections. First, I'll be joined by Supriya Kumar, who's the manager of global projects and partnerships at Candid. She supports the organization's quantitative and qualitative research and data-driven initiatives with the goal of advancing knowledge and practice in philanthropy. She'll provide an overview of the results of the new report focused on data from 2017 and its accompanying tools. Next, we'll do a deeper dive into the 2017 philanthropic response by focusing on 2 of the big disasters that year, Hurricanes Harvey and Maria, with our guest speakers, Sasha Cox from Attack Poverty and Janice Petrovich, author of the La Red study on philanthropy funding in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. Finally, we'll open up the floor for your questions. We'll do our best to get to all of your questions by the end of the webinar. Before we dive into the data, I'd like to take a moment to thank our generous funders. We appreciate the generous lead support from the Irene W. and C.B. Pennington Foundation, the UPS Foundation, and the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation. The work we're sharing with you today builds on a long partnership between the Center for Disaster Philanthropy and Candid, one that taps into the respective strengths and expertise of each of our organizations. CDP's mission is to transform disaster giving by providing timely and thoughtful strategies to help donors plan for and respond to domestic and international disasters in order to minimize their impact on vulnerable populations and communities. CDP aims to increase the effectiveness of contributions given to disasters, bring greater attention to the life cycle of disasters from preparedness and planning to relief to rebuilding, recovery, and resilience efforts, and provide relevant advice from experts with deep knowledge of disaster philanthropy. Candid was formed earlier this year when Foundation Center and GuideStar joined forces to become one organization. Our partnership with Candid allows us to collect and share better data about disaster philanthropy so that funders will have knowledge and tools to be more effective in their disaster-related giving. Disasters are, by definition, unpredictable, so we tend not to think about them until they happen. Although disasters may not be predictable, they do happen with regularity. At CDP, we have long believed that the scope, scale, and frequency of disasters will only intensify. We've witnessed that this year with the recent spate of disasters, including Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas and North Carolina, the wildfires in California, and Cyclone Idai in Mozambique. Candid has thus far tracked more than 46 million in pledges for Hurricane Dorian, primarily from corporations, but also from foundations and public charities. While disasters may shock us, they shouldn't surprise us. They will happen, and philanthropy will be called upon to respond. Given the inevitability of disasters, it is imperative for funders to make use of their dollars in the most effective way possible. In that spirit, our report and tools focus on three key questions. First, how did the funding community respond to disasters in 2017? What did they fund? How much funding did they provide overall? Second, how does the response of foundations fit into the larger landscape of disaster giving? How does foundation funding compare to other sources of funding, such as corporate giving, bilateral, multilateral aid, and government assistance? And finally, what can funders do to become more effective in terms of disaster-related funding? To tell us more about our report, I'm now pleased to turn the microphone over to Supriya. Supriya, glad you could join us today.
Great, thank you, Bob. So to examine these questions, our team at Candid started the process 6 years ago by working with an expert technical advisory committee to develop a project taxonomy that allows us to classify various types of disasters as well as assistance strategies. Disaster types can be classified as natural disasters, such as floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, and earthquakes, man-made accidents, which include things like oil spills and building collapses, or complex humanitarian emergencies, like the current crisis in Syria. In addition, we have a fourth general bucket that we include in our analysis, general disasters, which includes unspecified funding for disasters or multiple disparate disasters. We also examine disaster assistance strategies. These strategies cover the full life cycle of disasters, from resilience, risk reduction and mitigation, to preparedness, to response and relief, and long-term reconstruction and recovery. This is the 6th annual report we've published using the taxonomy as our guiding framework. For this year's report, we examined 2017 funding, which is the latest year for which complete data are available. Sources of data include IRS returns and information reported directly to Candid through our electronic reporting program. This report focuses on 2017 because there's a lag time of more than 1 year before Candid receives foundation tax returns and can begin processing and coding grants data. Some of the major disasters and humanitarian crises that affected people globally in 2017 included Hurricane Harvey, which devastated 60 counties in Texas. Hurricane Irma caused widespread devastation in the United States and the Caribbean. Hurricane Maria caused massive destruction in Dominica, the Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. 2 major earthquakes struck Mexico in September within 2 weeks of each other, killing hundreds and injuring thousands of people. And famines in Africa and civil unrest in Syria and Yemen continued, further increasing the number of refugees, asylum seekers, and internally displaced people. Drawing upon 12 data sources, we documented approximately $45 billion in disaster-related giving in 2017. In this year's report, we continue to examine funding beyond the largest US foundations and include in the overall analysis contributions by non-US donors, public charities, and smaller foundations. We hope that this enables us to see a much broader picture of institutional disaster philanthropy. From those sources that I mentioned above, we identified $504 million in funding for disasters and humanitarian crises based on what was available in Candid's publishing data for 2017. If we look at philanthropic funding by disaster type, we see that 2/3 of the funding, 65%, went to natural disasters. Half of the total disaster-related giving in 2017, which is around $250 million, went to storms, which is not surprising as many funders responded to the damage caused by Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. 12% was directed to complex humanitarian emergencies, such as the crisis in Yemen. 23% was for general disasters, and man-made accidents received less than 1%, or just under $1 million. With respect to disaster assistance strategies, The largest proportion of foundation funding, 64%, went to response and relief efforts. We noticed that 17% went toward reconstruction and recovery, and only 2% each went toward resilience measures and disaster preparedness measures. In 2017, 72% of grant dollars went to North America, with 11% going to Latin America and Mexico, 8% for the Caribbean, 4% to Asia, 3% to Africa, and 2% for Europe and Russia. We noticed that funding in 2017 shifted back to North America, in large part because of the 3 major hurricanes. The increase in Latin America and Mexico stems from the 2 earthquakes that hit Mexico. Responding to disasters is an enormous task that no single sector can accomplish on its own. So I'm going to quickly give a rundown of what giving looked like from other funding sources in 2017, starting with corporate giving. We identified $275.4 million from 634 pledges based on data gathered from the US Chamber of Commerce and Candid's database. In both cases, these figures often represent information available from press releases, websites, and voluntary reporting by corporations themselves. This slide shows the breakdown of corporate giving by the top natural disasters funded. Earlier this year, the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, Candid, and the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy conducted an online survey of US households about household charitable donations in support of disaster aid efforts in 2017 and 2018. The key findings from 2017 include 31% of US households made a disaster-related donation in 2017, averaging $80 per household. From that, we can infer that US households may have donated as much as $3 billion to disaster aid efforts in 2017. Some top motivations for disaster giving were the scale of the event and the number of people affected, personal connections to the location of the disaster, and media coverage on the disaster. Continued support, however, waned in years following a disaster. In 2017, for example, only 2% donated to support recovery from disasters that occurred in earlier years. 27% of US households donated to US disasters, while 4% donated to disasters that occurred outside of the US. Among households that made a charitable donation, 8% allocated all of their charitable contributions to disaster-related activities in 2017, while 37% of households donated to both disaster-related and non-disaster-related activities in 2017. We are noticing that individuals and organizations often donate via online platforms and crowdfunding sites. So we took a look at 2 online platforms, Global Giving and Network for Good. In 2017, Network for Good helped direct $12.5 million in donations for disasters and humanitarian crises, representing nearly 200,000 individual donations. But this is only 3% of the nearly $415 million that was contributed through their software platform. Global Giving raised $27.6 million for disasters, supporting 243 projects. This is more than 7 times the amount they raised for disasters in 2016. Individuals are also increasingly giving through donor-advised funds, such as those managed by Fidelity Charitable and Vanguard Charitable. Based on 2017 data, individuals gave $60 million through Fidelity and $20.2 million through Vanguard for disasters. This provides a small snapshot of money flowing to disasters from donor-advised funds, as these are only 2 of the many donor-advised fund management companies. With regard to international government aid, which is by far the largest flow of aid for disasters, we see that the official development assistance by 29 government members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's Development Assistance Committee, or DAC, totaled $21 billion for disasters in 2017. 66% of this were for complex humanitarian emergencies, while 9% went for natural disasters. Non-DAC government donors and multilateral organizations contributed an additional $1.9 billion, with 71% given to complex humanitarian emergencies and 8% to natural disasters. In the US, we see that FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, distributed $15.6 billion in grants and assistance for US disasters in 2017. That was an increase of $11.9 billion from the previous year. Of this money, FEMA distributed $14.4 billion for storms, $704.7 million for wildfires, and $475.7 million for floods. The top recipient locations were Puerto Rico, Texas, and Florida. The Department of Housing and Urban Development also allocated $2.7 billion in recovery efforts in 2017 to states and local governments to recover from 2015 and 2016 disasters, which included Hurricanes Joaquin and Patricia and the Louisiana floods. Funds were used toward eligible disaster recovery activities, including housing rehabilitation, public improvements, and economic development. So combined with foundation funding, all these sources added up to $45 billion for disaster assistance in 2017, based on what we could discover. When considering foundation funding, it is really important to understand this broader mosaic of disaster and humanitarian aid. Since this is our sixth report, Candid and the Center for Disaster Philanthropy have been tracking data on how US foundation funds have been changing through from 2013 to 2017. An analysis of the funding by 1,000 of the largest US foundations shows that these foundations have contributed, on average, $172 million per year for disasters between 2013 and 2017. There was a dramatic spike in 2014, largely due to grants for the Ebola outbreak, after which funding declined over the next 2 years. The storms of 2017 have, however, dramatically raised the total donations, as we can see in this slide.
Okay, thank you so much. That's Supriya Kumar from Candid, and we want to thank her for that report. By the way, this analysis can be downloaded for free from the site disasterphilanthropy.candid.org. And we're also making a recording of this webinar, and you'll receive a link in a follow-up email. And we'll also post the full recording and summary on our website. We'll invite Kumar or Samira back in just in a few minutes so that she can take your questions. But we're going to go on now. And before I do it, just a reminder that the PDF report is complemented by the Measuring the State of Disaster Philanthropy dashboard, which allows users to interact with the data based on their specific areas of interest. And the dashboard provides analysis and aggregated data. For users interested in seeing details at the grant or disbursement level, we've also built a mapping platform that visualizes who's funding what and where, which can also be found on the site. Last year, CDP also released several how-to videos to help you learn how to use the dashboard and mapping platform on an in-depth level. These are available on the About section of the website and are a way to help you use these tools to your greatest advantage. So just a reminder, if you do have a question, you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to your questions later in this webinar. But right now we want to go on to meet one of our guests today to help us better understand the story behind the data. And joining us is Sasha Cox from Attack Poverty. Sasha Cox has been the Director of Disaster Recovery with Attack Poverty since 2017. She served in 3 disasters, including personally being affected by Hurricane Ike while living in Louisiana. She's provided numerous trainings in disaster recovery and written the attack poverty process for home repair, which has been shared and utilized by multiple organizations. Sasha, welcome to this webinar.
Oh, thank you for having me.
And I understand you've got a few pictures that you'd like to share with us about some of your experiences with Harvey.
Yes, absolutely. They'll be going just as we talk, and you can get to see who's been serving and who we partner with, and just different things that we've been able and blessed to be able to serve in the communities.
And do you want to talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, absolutely. So within this first picture right here, you can see how just different ways that we're able to serve. That's actually myself in the dumpster. But part of what we're able to do is really empower residents to take charge of their recovery while pursuing transparent relationships that really build trust to increase the capacity of others. And we're seeing this as a major need within the under-resourced communities through different things like spiritual growth, education, revitalization, and basic needs. So we've been able to really partner with a lot of great organizations such as CDP. We've been able to bring in volunteers in order to offset a lot of the costs and just be better stewards of those funds that y'all been mentioning.
So the name of your organization is Attack Poverty, and you find yourselves now getting involved in disasters. Tell us a little bit more about the intersection of poverty and disasters.
Absolutely. So we really were serving in disaster recovery starting in 2015. The Brazos River within the Fort Bend County really spilled over. We had different floods, 3 in a row. We had in 2015, 2016, and 2017 with Harvey. And those floods directly impacted the lower income communities, which is where we are already stationed and serving before they happen. So we actually have 10 locations. We're international and domestic organization, and our communities that we're already in were directly impacted. And so we were going to serve, and as we were serving, these disasters kept hitting over and over and over. We realized that this is something that is part of our area. This is part of our culture, and the under-resourced communities are the first to be hit, just because a lot of infrastructure is not taken into place and considered with growth around us. And so part of that is our call to empower people to attack poverty in their life and communities, in these under-resourced communities. So we've been able to really help by really assisting and advocating and helping train these different residents how to find their own contractors, how to read quotes, how to manage their home repairs. And really through all that we're doing, we're really trying to restore dignity to these communities and ensuring that we are creating confidence, not just with these disasters, but also in home repair and life in general.
Were you engaged in home repair before the disaster hit? And how did it change after Hurricane Harvey?
Yes, we were. Within the 10 locations we have, we would do probably about 4 to 7 revitalization projects throughout a course of a year. Once these disasters hit, we did create a whole process to really implementing whole resources for that, whether it be grants, whether it be volunteers, and eventually an entire department dedicated to serving not just those communities that we're already in, but entire counties. So we are serving in Harris County, Brazoria County, and Fort Bend County, as well as leading in a lot of those long-term recovery groups, just to make sure that we're all communicating and staying within those collaborative efforts.
So we often hear about the importance of connecting locally, and I would like you to talk a little bit about the fact that you were working in these communities before Harvey hit. Can you tell us a little bit about why that made a difference and how it helped you in your recovery work?
Yeah, so like I said, we were already in these communities. We were already walking the streets, walking hand in hand with these people, either through different jobs for life classes, whether after school programs or UCAN academies. So we know them on a very personal level. We've walked with them through trials, tribulations. We know the local government. We know what churches and organizations are already there serving. So when these disasters hit, we're not a stranger coming in. We're already a friend. And we're also someone that can help vet and validate a lot of services coming in. So there was a lot of restrictions and hesitation from the under-resourced community, especially with local government, federal government agencies. So we were able to invite them in to have intake and even outreach events with us at our locations to best connect these communities with these different resources that were available.
So it's now 2.5 years or so since Hurricane Harvey hit. Some would think you might be back to normal, but that doesn't seem to be the case. How would you describe the state of the community to now, and what kind of unmet needs do you still see?
Yeah, I think that's a big misconception that, oh, within a year, everybody should be back in their home, or within 2 years, oh, that everything should be right. But statistics show that it takes 3 to 5 years just physically to recover from a disaster. And then it could take another 10 to 15 years to economically recover. That's just not individual homes, that's within an entire community. So we are still seeing the home repair side as a need. We're seeing a huge increase in just lasting trauma. So a mental health piece, which we've actually included as a new program as part of our disaster recovery efforts to do in-house counseling, because we saw it as such a need. Every time it rains, people really get hesitant and nervous, and we get a lot of calls. But a really big need that we're seeing is the disaster recovery agencies kind of sticking around and making those blue skies plans and continuing that. Because as we've experienced, we've been hit 3 years in a row, and then even with Imelda, we've experienced some residuals from that. And we're realizing that we have to keep a team, we have to stay ready, we have to stay prepared, and that's a great way that we've been able to partner with CDP, is we've been able to equip and train a team, we've been able to equip and train other organizations through our partnership with you guys.
So we were pleased that the Center for Disaster Philanthropy was able to provide you with a grant during this period. Could you talk just a little bit about how this grant will be able to help you carry out your work further?
Oh, absolutely. So with our grant, we've been able to increase capacity. So at one point we had, 150 homes sent to us with 3 people on the team. So we've been able to really impact more communities by increasing our team and our efforts and going into more counties, which was such a need. We now have a full warehouse with immediate and long-term recovery tools and equipment and different things for cleaning out that our organization is able to use, but we're also able to bless other organizations to utilize that. And something as simple as a truck and a trailer, these are things that we were able to, again, serve. A lot of people don't realize that organizations are hit very hard with these disasters, and to able to have that support, not to utilize your own vehicles in these construction zones, but to have those resources to better serve, it really serves the team in order for them to be able to serve so much more outside the walls of the office. So we've been truly blessed to be able to really increase our efforts and even our resources to serve where we are, and even to help equip others to serve where they are.
Well, that's great, Sasha. Thank you so much for the work you and your team are doing in Harvey. And for those listening, this is Sasha Cox from Attack Poverty. And if you've got a question for Sasha, you can use the box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try to get to your question in just a few minutes. Right now, we want to bring into this discussion Janice Petrovich. And Janice is a consultant to foundations and non-governmental organizations in the areas of philanthropy, policy, research, evaluation, and program strategy. She's the past executive director and vice president of LARED, where she was the lead author of a report profiled in this year's State of Disaster Philanthropy entitled Philanthropy in Puerto Rico After Hurricane Maria: How a Natural Disaster Put Puerto Rico on the Philanthropic Map and Implications for the Future. Janice, thanks so much for joining us. And I understand you've got some slides you want to share with us now.
I do, and thank you. Thank you for having me, and hello, everyone who's online. I have been living here in Puerto Rico, where I'm from, and was here during the hurricane. So although we did a study, my experience was also informed by the experience of being without electricity for 4 months and without water for some weeks, and so on. I wanted also to point out that the organization Red de Fundaciones, which means the network of foundations, is the local network of the local association of grant makers, but it has just recently undergone a name change. So the slide that you see, which is at the right-hand side, says Philanthropia Puerto Rico, is Philanthropy Puerto Rico, is the new name and the new look for the organization. So La Red is now Philanthropia Puerto Rico. You should be seeing some slides of some of the pictures of some of what Puerto Rico looked like after the hurricanes, and the activities that you are seeing pictured are those of NGOs on the ground that were doing the work of recovery and relief, immediate recovery and relief, because as you probably heard, the government was a bit slow on the uptake. I wanted to cover 3 topics in my conversation today. I wanted to tell you some about the study findings. You can see that on the next slide that says 3 topics. I wanted to point out some of the trends that we viewed in the study that was conducted, and also to point out some of what we learned and the conclusions. In the next slide, I am pointing out some of the key some key information about philanthropy in Puerto Rico before the hurricanes. Puerto Rico foundations are few and they're small, and in total, they typically, in a given year, donate some $25 million for a variety of organizations and fields. Historically, that amount, even as small as it might sound to some of you who live in big states, this is historically about 4 or 5 times what foundations outside of Puerto Rico donate, including national foundations. So outside of Puerto Rico, national and international foundations typically have donated something like $6 million, which comes to about $2 per person. And comparisons from Foundation Center data show that in the least benefiting area of the United States, which is the South, typically foundations in the US contribute something like $200 per person, and in a place like New York City, something like $2,000. The other aspect of philanthropy in Puerto Rico before Maria is that the individual contributions that were received by community-based groups were typically from locals, Puerto Ricans supporting Puerto Rican organizations. Next slide. After Maria, there was a huge explosion of giving, which helped us to get back on our feet. Everybody showed up. National foundations, international nonprofits, community foundations, individuals, a huge amount of crowdfunding and lots of in-kind contributions, attempting to get in through our clogged waterways. You probably heard some of the horror stories of stuff not getting where it was supposed to. In the next slide, it explains a bit of what we attempted to do with the study. We conducted surveys and interviews and looked at public documents, and we looked at the 41 top and most visible sources of philanthropic support. That is, those organizations that were covered in the media as providing $500,000 or more of monetary contributions in response to the disaster. These 41 institutions that we interviewed and studied were composed by Puerto Rico-based foundations, also non-Puerto Rico-based philanthropic entities. By non-Puerto Rico-based philanthropic entities, I mean national foundations or international organizations such as Comic Relief or Oxfam that distribute monies after disasters. But also some of these organizations that were distributing money included nonprofit-based groups, including La Red, and also Puerto Rico-based nonprofit groups, and one private fund. Next slide. So to give you a sense of what the surveys and the study told us about, let us know about the amount of donations that were gathered and distributed, the total commitment that those interviewed reported is $400 million for Puerto Rico. This is in the 1 year between September 2017 and September 2018. Some contributions have been coming in even after this survey, but this is to that moment. This includes about 25 million in double counting, and the reason is that some folks used us as intermediaries. For example, if a local foundation received a grant from a national foundation, it might be counted in the national foundation's grant support as well as in the local foundation's grant support. So we calculate there's about 25 million in double counting. And so we'd say that it's probably more in the vicinity of 375 million that was collected after distributed after the hurricanes. This amount is about 60 times what Puerto Rico typically gets according to foundation center data. And again, if you divide it amongst the population, it comes to about 107 per person, which is still short of what the least place that received the least donations in the US, which is the South. In the next slide, we took a look at where the donors were located, who was providing these funds, and identified that the majority of the funds were coming from organizations that were located outside of Puerto Rico. About 2.5 times more funds came from organizations outside of Puerto Rico than organizations within Puerto Rico. But interestingly, Puerto Rico foundations really came up to the bat, also contributing more than they typically contribute in a particular year. And next slide. I begin to identify here some of the important trends that we observed in this study. I will mention 4. The first one is the proliferation of funds as funding vehicles. These were special funds that were set up in response to the disaster. Of the funds within the study, we were able to identify about $310 million that were raised through 26 funds. These funds were created by nonprofit groups outside of Puerto Rico, such as Hispanic Federation. There was one private fund also in the US that committed a huge amount. Local foundations created funds, and local nonprofit groups also created funds. The largest funds were one by an entrepreneur, a Puerto Rican entrepreneur who created a $100 million fund, Hispanic Federation, a diaspora fund, and Unidos por Puerto Rico. Those were the 3 largest funds. Next slide. To tell you a little bit about these funds, because they were seen by us as a rather interesting philanthropic development that we had not had experienced before. The source of the donations for these funds was very diverse. Individuals, foundations, crowdfunding, platforms also all contributed to the development of these funds. The majority of the funds that we studied were to provide resources to local nonprofits. So these funds were providing grants to local nonprofits. But interestingly, many funds were created by organizations that had no prior history of grant making. Some of them were NGOs, community-based grassroots groups. They had never had a grant making experience, but interestingly, they seem to have done a wonderful job at it. Next slide speaks of another trend that we observed, which was the activation of the Puerto Rican diaspora. It became very visible to us that Puerto Ricans, even when they moved and created a new life outside of Puerto Rico, their ties that bind to the island are very strong. There were diaspora funds. An entrepreneur, as I mentioned, created a fund. There were 2 new foundations that were created and endowed by Puerto Ricans in the United States. And funds were created in cities and in states that had large Puerto Rican foundations. And within US foundations and funds, we saw Puerto Ricans and Latinos as champions to get aid to Puerto Rico. The next slide speaks of a third trend, which was a surge in individual giving. A lot of it, as I mentioned, was through crowdfunding platforms. Tens of thousands of individual donors. Hispanic Federation told us that they had over 200,000 individual donors. A Hurricane Maria fund was out of the Center for no, I'm forgetting the organization, but this was a fund that again had 28,000 donors. Puerto Rico Community Foundation reports 23,000 donors. So crowdfunding platforms and social media were very important in attracting individual donors. And we also had international crowdfunding that was new to Puerto Rico, such as Comic Relief, it never had been here before. Center for Disaster Philanthropy, thank you again. Global Giving had not been in Puerto Rico as some ever, and some not as robustly as they were. So that was the third trend. And in the next slide, the fourth trend that we are able to report is the fact that celebrities were hugely prominent in the philanthropic response to the hurricane. Many of you have heard of the response of Lin-Manuel Miranda, Ricky Martin, and politicians. In fact, the governor's wife created the biggest fund in Puerto Rico, which is called Unidos for Puerto Rico. A fifth philanthropic trend was that donors tapped local knowledge. Most donors would ask for advice locally. They came to learning visits. They participated in learning groups. Some funded through local organizations, and grants to local organizations were favored. And in fact, a few grant-making organizations established offices here, like hired local staff, set up offices, and they're still operating today. Moving quickly then to some lessons that we learned along the way in the next slide. It is, the first is that how important it is when funders who are not familiar with a place tap local knowledge. Local NGOs were hugely important in the relief and recovery effort. They were on the ground immediately, even as trees were down and big machines could not get to people. NGOs were hugely important, and I think the recognition of the importance of local NGOs was pretty obvious in the grant making that occurred after the hurricane. And I think a very important lesson to those of us who ended up making decisions about grants is that Social justice, as Sasha mentioned, is very important. The poorest communities are the ones that are most affected. And once the relief effort has sort of got things under control and new funding starts coming in from the federal government, which has been very slow in the case of Puerto Rico, grant makers need to shift their grant making strategies from focusing on relief to thinking about how do we make the distribution of those government funds more equitable and effective. In the next slide, I will quickly just go through some of the conclusions of the study. First is that national foundations, which have been pretty absent from Puerto Rico, are now here, and we hope they stay and are making every effort so that that does happen. We are very conscious, I think, more now in Puerto Rico about the importance of the diaspora and the fact that even though people have left, they are still tied. And we're very pleased that Puerto Rico is now on philanthropy's radar. For now, we hope it continues over a long period of time. As those of you who are familiar with major disasters like Katrina in New Orleans, you well know that New Orleans has been in recovery and rebuilding mode for the last 12 years. Our island was devastated similarly, and we need to be here for the long haul. I wanted to let you know with the next slide that the full report is available, and I'm providing a link to it. And finally, I just want to thank Center for Disaster Philanthropy and all of you. Somos Filantropía means we are philanthropy. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Janice, for that fascinating report, and thanks as well to Sasha for her presentation. Taking into account both large and smaller regional foundations, as well as public charities and international foundations, we documented over 500 million in giving from institutional philanthropy in 2017. It's clear that foundations bring substantial resources to the table. But think of this, at the same time, across all sectors, we found 45 billion in giving from government sources. That's the imperative that larger network of government, private, and corporate donors build partnerships that can help maximize and leverage limited dollars. We believe the tools we've developed can help donors understand the funding landscape more fully and identify opportunities to address funding gaps, increase collaboration, and make more strategic decisions. You can help us make these tools more robust. We invite foundations and corporate donors to share their data with us directly. One of the challenges in reporting is that we often have limited information about what specific disaster assistance strategies are being employed. When sharing data, we invite funders to provide more precise descriptions so that they can understand more fully how donors are investing across the disaster life cycle. Our analysis relies on publicly available data, but we know there is additional giving we are not accounting for, particularly from foundations outside of the US, smaller and regional foundations, and corporate giving. The more we can do on this front, the better equipped our tools will be to foster greater collaboration and coordination in the field. Please contact Supriya Kumar, and you can see her email address up here, supriya.kumar@candid.org, at Candid, if you'd like to add your data. We hope one of the takeaways from today's session is a realization that response and relief is just part of a larger picture that takes the full disaster life cycle into account. In the last few months, we've seen hurricanes, super typhoons, floods and fires cause devastation in several countries across the globe. And while it has been heartening to see organizations and individuals actively respond in the immediate aftermath of these events, there's a real opportunity for philanthropists to be less reactive and more strategic in their disaster-related investments. The full life cycle of disasters encompasses, on the front end, risk reduction, mitigation, preparedness, and resilience efforts that can minimize the economic and human losses associated with disasters. And on the back end, recovery and reconstruction efforts that can help communities rebuild and thrive following the devastation of disasters. Although few, if any, foundations consider themselves to be disaster philanthropists, all foundations will at some time or another find themselves facing the questions of how best to respond when disasters occur. And like all other forms of philanthropy, a strategic approach is typically more effective than an ad hoc one. A goal of CDP and of this project is to raise awareness of the fact that all funders have a role to play with respect to disaster philanthropy. This report provides funders with the data and tools they need to step into that role effectively. We've got a few minutes left for questions, and I want to start by asking Supriya if she was surprised at the results that show so little money going into resilience and preparedness, and whether you see any trends that are hopeful about that going forward.
Hi, thanks, Bob. Yeah, it was a bit surprising. I think last year especially, we were a little optimistic when we saw that resilience and reduction mitigation had increased slightly. And more importantly, we saw that reconstruction and recovery efforts had reached almost 20% last year. So it was disappointing this year to see that once again, there was just a huge response. And part of it also had to do with the fact that the hurricanes were a pretty, major disaster that occurred in the US, all three happening pretty close to each other. So in that essence, it wasn't as surprising to see those results, but it was a little disheartening to see less money going to preparedness. And hopefully, as funders see the data and see this report, they're able to respond better and put more money into those efforts.
Is there anything else that caught your eye in this year's report, something that stuck out for you?
We were quite surprised to see the amount of funding that increased in FEMA's giving as well. There was this huge giving effort, almost $11 billion more. So that was pretty startling. But I think, as always, the multilateral and bilateral funding is quite a large amount and showcases how much money goes. They're more focused usually in complex humanitarian crises. So I think that number slightly increased as well, which is a little surprising.
Well, thank you. And thank you again for all the hard work that you and your colleagues put into this report this year.
Absolutely. And I know we ran through the numbers very quickly. So if anyone else has questions about the data, please feel free to email me.
Great. I've got a question for Sasha Cox that came in. The person wanted to know a little bit about the role of NGOs in disasters, and you talked a little bit about that in your report. But I guess the sort of preface to that question sort of assumes that government agencies, particularly FEMA, are doing much, if not most, of the work. And so maybe you could talk a little about the critical role that NGOs play in disaster recovery work.
Yes, I'd say that we play a huge connector between the communities and these. There have been where FEMA has shown up and definitely provided funds for individual residents. There's a lot of confusion about how to utilize those funds. Where can they go? What do we do now with it? Does it just sit until we get further instructions? There's just a lot of confusion around the different programs. We're able to help alleviate a lot of that. We're also able to play a big advocator, not only in the disaster that's happening or that has happened, but future disasters. So we can be the voice for the under-resourced communities and even help change processes and laws within the federal agencies and even local agencies to best serve and to get better with every time we are impacted, because we will be impacted again. So for us to be able to be that voice for those under-resourced communities that typically do not have one, which is pretty huge, it's pretty critical. And to be a storyteller and to get these different agencies actually boots on the ground with us to really see the communities for really who they are.
A question for Janice. We saw a little bit of this in Texas, where most of the dollars seem to go to Houston rather than to rural areas. And someone inquired about whether most of the money was going to San Juan as opposed to other areas of the island.
Yes, I also wanted to add to Sasha's comments that in Puerto Rico, the nonprofits were the first boots on the ground and did a superb job, even as FEMA response was extremely slow. And this was all over the island. Because of roads, the difficulty in getting stuff to folks in outside of the San Juan area, it is true that the organizations in the San Juan area benefited most at the outset. Nevertheless, you have to remember that about half of the population of Puerto Rico is in the metropolitan area. Metropolitan is big. It also includes the towns of Carolina, Bayamón, and Rio Piedras. It's a big set of people. There have been efforts, very concentrated efforts, to try to make sure that the distribution improves, and I think that foundations have been doing a great job. The Hurricane Maria Fund, bringing in groups from all over the island, going to the island to meet with groups. Same thing, I think, can be said for the newly announced Flamboyant Foundation for the Arts, funded a lot of arts groups all over the island, Hispanic Federation. I think we all made an effort to make sure that different parts of the island were served, also with microgrids. What do they call these things? I'm not an engineer, but for electricity in rural towns, and water supplies in rural areas. There has been quite a bit that happened, even though at the beginning it was slow because of the difficulty in just getting there.
We have time for one last question. Sasha, I want to ask if you can give funders some advice on where they could be invested in planning and preparedness activities that could help NGOs. Any suggestions?
Yeah, absolutely. Organizations, they typically are learning, at least this is what we've experienced. We're very much a learning organization. So we've had to learn along the way how to help and serve in these different disasters that we've been hit with. But there's more disasters out there, and if you can provide us with contacts for trainings, with connections for even greater fundings, like I said, when those skies are blue, that's really huge. For us, a lot of organizations literally basically shut down either that department or altogether after about 2 years after disaster. And like I said before, it could take multiple years in order to create even somewhat of a sense of a whole community. So enabling these organizations to at least keep a team that's trained, that's able to share knowledge, that they can continue serving and training other organizations, that's really huge, because so much knowledge is lost after every disaster, because there's this huge basically breakdown whenever grants are gone. So I would say a big support would be, again, trainings for all disasters, where they're not having to create them from experience. And then also creating some kind of sustainable funding, maybe not just this huge big chunk when one disaster hits, but a continual support for whenever disasters do come, so they can serve more efficiently and quickly.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're now out of time. I want to remind everybody that the report and the accompanying tools can be found at disasterphilanthropy.candid.org. So thanks so much to Supriya of Candid for providing an overview of the report and tools, and to Sasha and Janice for sharing your insights today. Thanks to the team at CDP, Ruja, Melanie, Tanya, Regine, for all you did to help with this. We also want to just thank all of our colleagues at Candid and to the funders for their partnership in this important work. If you've got questions or thoughts that were not addressed during today's call, you may email them to tanya.gulliver-garcia@disasterphilanthropy.org. Thanks so much for your time and have a great afternoon.